privilege here to introduce our guest speaker. Some of you may know her. My wife, Destiny, will be sharing with you the message. It's absolutely fantastic. So if you want to just join with me as we just pray for her and pray God's blessing over this morning. Heavenly Father, thank you so much for your love and your gracious mercy on all of us. And I thank you for the way you speak to everybody. I thank you right now for sharing your word with Destiny. Lord, I pray you bless her words, that her thought and her speech would be your thought and your speech this morning. Lord, I pray that our hearts would be receptive to what the word you've placed in her heart. And God, I just thank you for your loving touch on this morning. In your name, amen.
Good morning. Hello. You'll notice that my first slide here this morning, it looks a lot like last Sunday. Jack preached on Samson last Sunday, and I was sitting there, and my message was all done and prepared, and I thought, okay, cool, God. You have this story, and you want somebody here to read something in the story. So if nothing else, just go home and read the story of Samson, because there's a message here for us today. Luckily, I think I'm a little bit different than Jack, so you probably won't have the exact same message as last Sunday. Last Sunday, Jack painted a picture of how he imagined Samson to be. He imagined Dave Inkster, who I think is sitting in the back there somewhere, this big, tall, strong, muscular man, and a mixture of Dave Inkster and Rennie Schultz with his long, flowing hair. That's sort of how he pictured Samson. We'll start with Judges chapter 13, starting at verse 1. The story of Samson starts with the birth of Samson. The Israelites again did what was evil in the Lord's sight. So the Lord handed them over to the Philistines 40 years. There was a certain man from Zorah, from the family of Dan, whose name was Manoah. His wife was unable to conceive and had no children. The angel of the Lord appeared to the woman and said to her, "It is true that you are unable to conceive and have no children, but you will conceive and give birth to a son. Now please, be careful, do not drink wine or beer or eat anything unclean, for indeed you will conceive and give birth to a son. You must never cut his hair, because the boy will be a Nazirite to God from birth, and he will begin the deliverance of Israel from the hands of the Philistines." So right at the start of the story, we can see God created Samson, and he had a huge calling on Samson's life. He's going to lead and start the deliverance of Israel from the Philistines. And in the story, we start to see that the Spirit of the Lord is starting to work in Samson. When he's on his way to Mahaneh-dan, the Spirit of the Lord began to stir in him in verse 25. And then we get to the part of the story where Samson sees, this one day he's out, and he sees this Philistine woman, and he wants this woman as his wife. There's this instant attraction, and this is the woman who he wants to marry. And his parents, they're not terribly thrilled about this. Like, is there nobody from the Israelites? Like, this is a Philistine woman. Is there nobody good enough from the Israelites? You have to choose that one. But this is the girl who Samson had his mind set on. And this was God's doing, actually. His parents didn't realize it at the time, but God was had this so that had this as his doing, so that he had an occasion to confront the Philistines, and he was going to use Samson in this. In Judges 14, verse 6, we see, "The Spirit of the Lord came upon him in power." Samson's on his way to Timnah, this woman who he loves. He's on his way to her vineyards, and there's this attacking lion who comes running towards him. And we see the Spirit of the Lord comes upon Samson in power. And with his bare hands, he rips this lion apart, as if he may have torn a young goat. And I'm reading this, and I'm thinking, as if he may have torn a young goat. Like, how many men here have torn a young goat apart with their bare hands? Like this is an attacking lion. And the story continues. So later on, he goes back, and it's the time of the wedding feast. On his way back towards the wedding feast, he sees the carcass of this dead lion he had earlier torn apart with his bare hands. And there's this dead carcass, and inside there's some honey. And so he scoops out, and he eats this honey from the dead carcass. And this is breaking one of God's rules that he had for him. And he continues on and gets to the wedding feast. When he arrives at the wedding feast, all the guests are there, and he tells the guests a riddle. He says, out of the strong something to eat, and out of the eater something to eat, and out of the strong something sweet. And the guests, they couldn't figure out this riddle. And so they go to Samson's wife and they strongly urge her to coax the answer out of Samson. Like, get your husband, get the answer out of him. Like, he's making a fool of us here. And when I say they're urging Samson's wife, I mean they're strongly urging her, as in, coax the answer out, or we're actually going to kill you and your family. That's how strongly they're urging her. And we read in Judges chapter 14, verse 16. Then Samson's wife threw herself on him, sobbing, "You hate me. You don't really love me. You've given my people a riddle, but haven't told me the answer." She cried the whole 7 days of the feast. So finally, he gave in and told her, because she continued to press him. And she in turn told the riddle to her people. So here we see a woman. She's obviously not pleased with the riddle that her husband told the guests at the wedding feast. She's not pleased with the choice that her husband has made. And we see a woman here who's also filled with fear of the circumstances surrounding her. And the fear of this woman, it is greater than her trust and her loyalty in her husband. And I think many women here, we could probably relate to that to some extent. There's probably many women here who've been unpleased with certain choices their husbands, or when I say husbands in this story, if you don't, there's men of many different aspects in our life. It could be a father, a brother, a son, a husband. Whoever the men in your life are, men and women, they're built very differently. But I think many women could relate to being unpleased with certain choices they make. And many women here probably have been filled with fear surrounding circumstances related to these things. And sometimes the fear surrounding these circumstances is greater than the trust or loyalty that we have to our husbands or to our men. So the guests solved the riddle, and it cost Samson. It cost him 30 linen garments and 30 sets of clothes. And then we see again in Judges chapter 14, verse 19, then the Spirit of the Lord came upon him in power. He goes out and he strikes down 30 men, takes their clothes, takes the linen garments, and gives them to the guest who had solved his riddle. And sometime later, he went back, and he was going to go back and visit his wife after this occasion had happened. Well, it turns out he arrives, and his father-in-law said, "Oh, I was so thoroughly sure you hated her, so I gave her to one of your friends." Now, how many men here would be thrilled if their wife had been given to their friends without any consultation? And Samson was not pleased with this, and we see his response. Samson's response was, so he went out, this is in chapter 15, verse 4, he went out and caught 300 foxes. I'm like, anything he does, this is just crazy. 300 foxes. Who here could catch 300 foxes? I think I've seen less than a dozen in my life. And he took torches, he turned the foxes tail to tail, and put the torches between each pair of tails. Then he ignited the torches and released the foxes into the standing grain of the Philistines. He burned up the piles of grain and the standing grain, as well as the vineyards and the olive groves. So when I read the story of Samson, if nothing else this morning, I think most women will look around and think, our men are actually pretty tame. They're not as wild and reckless as I thought. I don't think any men here have torn apart a lion with their bare hands, and probably not even a goat for that matter. And I haven't heard of anyone striking down 30 men and stripping them of their linens, or catching 300 foxes and setting all the fields on fire. And our men are pretty tame in comparison to Samson. But God created Samson, and in his character there is this wildness and this power and this strength, and this is a man who God created for a very specific purpose. Following this story, when he burns all the fields, there's a story, and it continues. I'm not going to go into the details here, but there's a story of revenge. And it ends up with Samson allowing his own people, the Israelites, to capture him and bind him up. And he's given himself in to the Israelites. And so they're going to hand him over to the Philistines. And the Philistines are approaching. And as they're approaching, they're shouting. So Samson's bound up here, and he hears the Philistines approaching, and he hears this shouting. And then we see, Judges chapter 15, verse 14, we read again, the Spirit of the Lord came upon him in power. We read this a few times in this story. And whenever we read that, something crazy is going to happen. It's about to get crazy. And sure enough, the bindings become like charred flax, and he breaks free. And the Spirit of the Lord is upon him in power. And he grabs, there's a fresh jawbone of a donkey he finds. He grabs this jawbone, and single-handedly, he takes this, and he strikes down. He defeats 1,000 men single-handedly. This is a wild, a reckless, a strong, a conquering, powerful man who God created and who he chose to lead the Israelites. Samson led them for 20 years. Samson was not perfect. We saw it earlier, he scooped honey out of the dead carcass and ate it, breaking a law of God's. And we also see it in chapter 16, verse 1. It talks about him spending a night with a prostitute. And the Bible's very clear about sexual immorality. This is not a perfect man. But despite his seemingly large flaws, God used Samson. So a little while later in the story, it comes to the part where Delilah enters in. Samson sees Delilah and he falls in love. He loves this woman and they're married. And this part of the story, when I was reading it, it really caught my attention. Because we see Delilah nagging Samson over and over again about his God-given strengths. We see Delilah nagging Samson about his God-given strength. And Samson responds. In chapter 16, verse 7, he responds, "If they tie me up with 7 fresh bowstrings that have not been dried, I will become weak like any other man." So during the night, Delilah does this, and then she calls out, "Samson, the Philistines are upon us." And Samson rises up, and he protects his home, and he protects his wife. He has not lost his God-given strength. Then we see Delilah continuing to nag Samson. And Samson responds. He told her, "If they tie me up with new ropes that have never been used, I will become weak like any other man." Again, during the night, Delilah does this, and then she calls out, "Samson, the Philistines are upon us." Again, Samson rises up. He defends his home and his wife. He has not lost his God-given strength. Delilah continues to nag, and Samson responds. He told her, "If you weave the 7 braids of my head with the web of a loom." Again at night she does this and then calls out, "Samson, the Philistines are upon us." Again, Samson rises up and protects his home and his wife. He has not lost his God-given strength. And at this part of the story, we see that Delilah questions his love for her. She says in chapter 16, verse 15, "How can you say, 'I love you'?" And our men are created very differently than us women. I think men and women are created very differently. And, we as women, we know what would make us feel loved. It's, if only he said exactly this. If only he cuddled me and poured out his heart crying, I would feel loved. If only he told me how beautiful I am, I would feel loved. If only he would do acts of service, maybe clean up my kitchen, I would feel so loved. If only he would call me or text me throughout the day, I would feel like he cared for me and I would feel loved. It is very easy for us to know what makes us feel loved. But guess what? They are not us. It is not easy for our men to know exactly what makes us feel loved. But the truth is, they do love us. They really, really love us. Just over a year ago, there was this time where we were driving. Jason and I were in the vehicle, and it was almost unavoidable that there was going to be this accident. And Jason's response, this is just deeply ingrained. This is a split-second reaction. This is what comes out. Deeply ingrained, he positions the vehicle so that he takes the hit and protects Hannah and myself. And luckily, we avoided that. But that is his reaction. He would die for us. He loves us. And in the story of Samson too, every time the Philistines are upon him, he rises up and protects his home and his family. So our men, they may not show us the perfect love, but make no mistake that the love they have for us is deep. So let's not question the love that they have for us again. So we're going to continue on in this story. We're talking about Delilah nagging, and she's nagging Samson. And it says in Judges chapter 16, verse 16, with such nagging, she prodded him day after day until he was tired to death. Well, I read that, I'm like, that's a bit of a dramatic response to nagging. Oh, are men so dramatic sometimes? But it's true. Delilah nagged him until he completely lost his God-given strength. He told her everything. She nagged him until she successfully took away his strength for her own benefit. She gained silver. Judges chapter 16, verse 19 say, he was subdued and his strength left him. So God put this story in my heart about a month ago, and the thing about learning something is you don't actually learn it until you put it into practice. And it's great when you get this insight. It's like, oh, cool, God, that's awesome. But then practicing it really sucks sometimes. And that's exactly what I had to do this last week. Because Jason happens to be leaving right after church. He's heading out for a nice camping adventure, getting away for 2 nights. And I love camping adventures. I've gone with him in the past. But this week it was a little bit different. This week, I was thinking about it, and all of a sudden I was thinking, hey, it's springtime. Like, aren't the bears just starting to wake up? And I was thinking about it. I'm like, coming to think about it, don't bears and moose, isn't this their mating seasons? They're filled with testosterone right now. And I was just, having a hard time this week. But the thing is, I couldn't even nag him about it because I'm preaching this message and I have to practice what I'm preaching. And and I was thinking, wouldn't it be nice just to suggest, hey, why don't you try camping at a campsite? And wouldn't it be nice just to suggest, hey, don't you want to take my dad camping with you? He loves it there. Wouldn't it be nice just to ask, hey, what about that fire ban? Are you sure it's a good idea to go right now? Or wouldn't it be nice to ask, is it safe with all these testosterone-filled animals coming out right now? And, wouldn't it be nice to remind him, hey, do you remember, there's that event we're invited to as a family? All of these things. But guess what? I couldn't. I have to practice what I'm preaching. Because God showed me this insight, and I believe it's true. So I cannot nag my husband. All of this nagging, it benefits me while it costs him. The truth is, Jason was created a man. He was created with a sense of adventure, a need to be wild and sometimes to be free. He was made to conquer chopping down wood and exploring islands. All of this nagging, it benefits me while costing my husband. And I do not want to be the wife who nags my husband, subduing him, robbing him of his God-given strengths. So I have to choose to trust in God. I love and admire my husband, and I choose to bless him to go on a wild, free, possibly dangerous adventure. And I have to practice what I preach. And sometimes this means that I have to take my fear and put it down and choose to trust ultimately in God's great power and in God's great purpose. I have to choose to put my fear to the side so that my fear is not greater than the trust and loyalty to my husband. And sometimes learning this lesson that I'm preaching means not being selfish in my desires. Now, just on a cool little side note, I did not nag Jason about this week, but my dad calls Jason up, just happens to call him up and say, hey, would you mind if I come camping with you? It sounds like fun. And Jason, he's actually excited about it. So Dad does happen to go with him for a night or two. So that's cool. Like, it's just God caring about these little details in our lives, you know. And so that's awesome. But yeah, God created wild, powerful, strong, reckless Samson. And he created him for his purposes, God's purposes. And God created our men also. So, there may be men here this morning who are like Samson at the end of this story. Subdued. Completely void of their God-given strengths. And to you this morning I say, this is not the end of the story. In Judges chapter 16 verse 28 we see, then Samson prayed to the Lord, O sovereign Lord, remember me. O God, please strengthen me just once more. Then he pushed with all of his might, and down came the temple. He had led Israel for 20 years. If you are void here this morning of all your God-given strength, go to the Lord, our sovereign God, who created you uniquely, and pray, "Oh God, please strengthen me once more."